Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very, very much for joining this webinar on health impacts of pesticides. My name is Phoebe Eng. I have been helping community members here on the island of Kauai share information about restricted use pesticides on this island. And part of that role is to share information on our right to know through a bill called Bill 2491. It is a bill that provides for a right to know about restricted use pesticides currently being used on our island and other protections. It is a bill being considered by the County Council of Kauai. With that, I'm going to introduce our two presenters. Our first presenter is Emily Marquez. She is staff scientist at Pesticide Action Network, which has offices all around the world, but Emily is based in Oakland. Emily began studying at the University of California, Berkeley. Her thesis is on the impact of contaminated soil on expression of genes that play a role in reproduction. She did her postdoc research at UC Davis and UC Berkeley, so welcome, Emily. Margaret Reeves is a senior scientist, also at Pesticide Action Network. She teaches and conducts research in tropical agricultural ecology. At Pesticide Action Network, Margaret focuses on environmental health and justice, particularly farm worker health and safety. Margaret is fluent in Spanish as well. So welcome, both of you. I will give the screen over now to Emily, who will give us the highlights of a study called A Generation in Jeopardy: How Pesticides Are Undermining Our Children's Health and Intelligence. So Emily, you will have the screen in a few seconds.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you, Phoebe. Last year we released the report, A Generation in Jeopardy, and the purpose of this report was to provide an overview of recent findings on children's health harms. So we looked at studies that we reviewed a bunch of studies that were basically taken from the past 10 years, and we looked at links between pesticide exposures and several diseases or disorders that are known to be on the rise. Pesticides are not the only chemicals a child may be exposed to during development, and we definitely want people to keep that in mind as we discuss some of the things we found in this or wrote about in this report. Children are exposed to some 3,000 synthetic chemicals, and these 3,000 synthetic chemicals I'm talking about are those that are manufactured at a high volume, which is 1 million pounds or more every year. But over the past 50 years, some 80,000 synthetic chemicals have been developed. So this mixture of chemicals that are present in our environment, some of which may or may not interact to impact human physiology and may or may not have synergistic effects, poses a huge unknown to human health. And in the health trends we looked at, study authors pointed to environmental factors as a potential cause. So I'm first going to talk about some data regarding the trends in children's health outcomes, and then discuss a few highlights from our report, plus talk about children's unique vulnerability to pesticides. And finally, I'll discuss some of our policy recommendations. So this figure is in our report, A Generation in Jeopardy, and it sums up several children's health harms and the increases in those health harms over the time period from 1975 to 2011. And we relied mostly on Centers for Disease Control data for this figure. Children today are increasingly impacted by learning disabilities and disorders, with a 17% increase in the number of children with developmental disabilities over the past 15 years. For cancer, the overall incidence, which means new cases of cancer, so this is actually sort of measuring growth of this disease. So the overall incidence is up 25% since 1975, and I'll show you a figure in a moment on that. That's from our report. For asthma, the data are less clear, mainly because asthma and pesticides have not been as well studied, and most existing studies that I've seen examine links between adult asthma and pesticides via occupational exposures. So farm workers exposure to pesticides, and pesticides as a respiratory irritant to farm workers. So this figure is the percentage of children diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder over the period of time from 1997 to 2008. And boys are in blue, girls are in red. Time is on the x-axis, and the percentage of children diagnosed with ADHD in those time periods is on the y-axis. Finally, boys are more likely to be affected, but girls are more often affected by the attention deficit part of this disorder. And ADHD increased an average of 3% per year for that time period. Autism prevalence has jumped over the past decade, and this graph shows the percentage of children diagnosed with autism over these time periods from 1997 to 2008. The percentage of children diagnosed with autism is on the y-axis. Again, in this graph, boys are in blue and girls are in red, with time on the x-axis. Centers for Disease Control data that has been taken from several sites in states across the U.S. suggests that 1 in 88 children are likely to be on the autism spectrum of this disorder. So that means they display symptoms or characteristics that are seen as being on the spectrum of autism symptoms, but not necessarily diagnosed with autism. So there's also the issue, which I think is pretty well discussed in the media, of whether or not an increase in diagnoses is part of this dramatic increase. But there are several researchers in this field that point to a combination of genetic and environmental factors. This graph depicts the incidence of cancer. Again, that means new cases, number of new cases, and that number is on the y-axis, and the x-axis again shows time period. So this is comparing between 1975 and 2004, and this is looking at children in two different age groups. So the blue bar shows children who are ages 0 to 14, and the red bar shows children who are in the larger group, ages 0 to 19. So every kid. And in this, oh, I'm sorry, I already said what I meant to say about incidence. So it's basically showing that the incidence of new cases is going up over time, or has gone up since 1975. So of the studies that we reviewed in our report, the most compelling evidence was from studies that looked at links between pesticides and neurodevelopment, and also those looking at pesticide exposures and linking those to certain childhood cancers. So for instance, home insecticide use during pregnancy can increase the risk of childhood leukemia, and this has been demonstrated in several public health studies. But we also found really interesting data on organophosphate pesticides. So organophosphate pesticides are insecticides, and they have neurotoxic routes of action, and they also have been shown to have adverse effects on neurodevelopment, on the development of the nervous system. So this organophosphate pesticides were, one example is chlorpyrifos. Chlorpyrifos is one of the pesticides that is a restricted use pesticide used on Kauai. And the studies on chlorpyrifos have some intriguing findings, with prenatal exposure to chlorpyrifos suggesting that there may be a link to developmental disorders, and also an increase in attention problems and an increase in ADHD. So there's a good amount of evidence that chlorpyrifos has negative effects on the proliferation, differentiation, and functioning of glial cells. And glial cells are cells that are associated with nerves, and they basically provide nutrition and structural support for neurons both during and after development. And also, just as another story about the history of chlorpyrifos, it's the reason that it is so well studied among the OP pesticides, which all have similar routes of action, is because chlorpyrifos was an ingredient in household insecticides up until 2001, when they were banned from home insecticide as a home insecticide ingredient. So one intriguing study by Virginia Rao, who is a researcher at Columbia University in New York, and her colleagues examined magnetic resonance images of children's brains, and they correlated measurements of certain brain regions with levels of chlorpyrifos found in umbilical cord blood. So this was looking at prenatal exposure to chlorpyrifos and looking at correlating this with the actual brain morphology in children that were 7 years old. So they found differences in the measurements, and they found at least 2 of those significant differences in brain regions that are normally sex dimorphic. And sex dimorphic means different between males and females. So we're actually seeing what looks to be a change in the architecture of the brain that's associated with chlorpyrifos exposure. And there were other interesting studies that came out while we were still drafting, but we didn't have the opportunity to incorporate them into the report. And one of them was by Horton et al., which is part of the same group that released this other magnetic resonance imaging study. And the study by Horton et al. Examined a previously found result, which was that chlorpyrifos exposure prenatally results in a reduced IQ. And they found what they looked at was the question of whether parental nurturance and environmental stimulation moderated those negative effects on the IQ. So looking at whether or not a good home environment based on certain scores that they gave out in their study would actually result in not reducing the IQ. I hope that makes sense. So basically they found that the impact of home environment, whether it was scored as good or beneficial or not so much, this impact did not moderate this adverse association. So it was found that there was no impact on IQ based on home environment, according to the study, and also a greater decrease in the one component of IQ called working memory was found in males. And this suggested, the author suggested that that males are more negatively impacted than females by prenatal chlorpyrifos exposure. So there's multiple routes of exposure to pesticides and other chemicals in a child's environment, both before and after birth. So just as I said earlier, a couple of these studies that were looking specifically at chlorpyrifos looked at prenatal exposure and did a statistical analysis about prenatal exposure and associations between IQ and brain morphology. So one route of exposure includes pesticide residues on food. But children are also lower to the ground, and they explore their world through hand-to-mouth behaviors, and many chemical residues have been found in household dust, including pesticides. So, for instance, efforts to train agricultural workers have helped to minimize contamination that could be transferred to homes via residues on workers' clothing, and that helps to minimize exposure of the occupants, of the families of those workers. And also, another reason why children are uniquely vulnerable to pesticides is that they also eat, breathe, and drink more for their size than adults. And thus, children can be exposed to a greater amount of environmental inputs because of their smaller size. An infant takes in about 15 times more water than an adult per pound of body weight. And up to age 12, a child inhales roughly twice as much air. And because they're still developing, these impacts can have long-term consequences. Research over the past several years has indicated that some chemicals can act at low doses, or they can have nonlinear dose-response curves. So these sorts of effects, for instance, low-dose effects, are not necessarily identified when using a traditional approach to risk assessment. And there's a number of researchers in the field of endocrine disruption who have made some detailed recommendations for how to address low doses and non-monotonic dose responses. So they're actually recommending that this be incorporated into the EPA's evaluation structure of evaluating chemicals. There's also the case of epigenetic impacts, which you may have heard of. This basically results in effects on the turning on or turning off of genes. And again, this is not a phenomenon that can necessarily be predicted by the way that EPA evaluates chemicals currently. Pardon me. A prime example of a chemical that acts at low doses is atrazine, and this is another restricted use pesticide identified by the Kaua'i and GMO bill. The European Union banned atrazine in 2003 because they found it was not possible to prevent atrazine from contaminating drinking water and at levels that were above the legal limit. And the EU, the European Union's legal limit, is actually lower than the US EPA legal limit. And that is because the EU takes a protective approach to human health, where if they are not sure that or certain that a chemical may or may not cause harm to human health, they simply say there's a flat level of atrazine or any other chemical that's allowed in their water. If they monitor and find that it's above, then they basically don't want to use that chemical in the European Union. So finally, though Parkinson's isn't a children's disease, I just thought I'd mention paraquat, which is another one of the restricted use pesticides that's identified by the Kaua'i and GMO bill. So paraquat is a highly poisonous herbicide, and it has actually been, it's currently in the process to be listed under the Rotterdam Convention, basically because it was nominated by the country of Burkina Faso, and this was the reason it was nominated to be listed under Rotterdam Convention is because there were poisonings occurring in the country, and Burkina Faso wants this listing to happen so that they can actually stop import of the chemical at their borders. So this isn't actually any other, it's not a ban, it's simply that if a country chooses to stop import, they can do so based on concerns they have over the health of their citizens. So the other thing I should mention is that paraquat has been linked heavily to occupational exposures. Paraquat has been linked heavily to Parkinson's disease in workers who were exposed to this chemical at work. So finally, more than 1 billion pounds of pesticides are used every year, and that means it's a problem that's really too big to solve at the household level. So we need to reduce this number, and we need to control pests without relying on chemicals that are known to harm children's health. And we also need to change the way we think about agriculture. So there's debate over whether genetically engineered crops can result in health harms or whether they yield more foods. But the fact is the use of GE crops is coupled with pesticide use, and their dominance in industrial agriculture has the further consequence of ramping up pesticide usage. I'm going to end there, and later on at the end of the webinar I will be sure to put up a slide that has a number of resources that you could go to if you're interested in visiting the PAN website as well. And we have some blogs that we publish every couple of weeks online. So thank you for your time.